Thank you, Mike. That was a perfect lead into the theme of our first panel, enabling public development, which is a core part of what you were just saying. Hold on to the asset, don't let go of it. The slides in all of the panels are just going to be rotating in the background while we speak. So there are no formal presentations. It's just a conversation. We'll discuss for about 45 minutes and then open up to the audience for about 15 minutes. So I'm delighted to have the three of you here today representing different public entities in the housing field. Kenzie Bach on the very left and Margaret Moran on the very right represent two housing authorities, so in a way the original public developer in the United States. And Deborah Goddard is Secretary of Housing in the state of Rhode Island. The two housing authorities are almost 100 years old. The Department of Housing is maybe 3 years old at this point, so it's a nice spectrum of old and new. In the first round, I'd like you all to introduce yourself, your organization, and how you are thinking about being a public developer. When and how does your organization act or intend to act as a developer, investor, owner, and/or manager? So all the points that Mike Connolly brought up. And maybe we'll begin on this side with Margaret in Cambridge, and then move on down.
Good afternoon, Margaret Moran. I'm the Deputy Executive Director for Development at the Cambridge Housing Authority. I've been at the Housing Authority for over 30 years. I'm the Director of the Department for nearly 10, but really involved in the Housing Authority's capital planning, repositioning, and reinvestment for the last 25 years, so a pretty depth of knowledge and experience here in Cambridge. As Susanna said, we've been here in Cambridge operating since 1935, 90 years. And we're not going anywhere. We've been here for 90 years. We plan to be here for 90 more. And to Representative Connolly's point, you know, the housing that we built back in the 30s and 40s and 50s are still units of housing that we've reinvested in and improved that continue to be a valuable asset to the Cambridge and larger communities. In terms of what the Housing Authority has been doing, we've been on an incredible reinvestment of our portfolio, which stemmed from a realization about 20 years ago that if we continue to stay the course, we were going to start losing the affordable units we had, and we certainly weren't going to see a growth of them. We had a deferred capital list of over $32 million, which based on the funding that we had, would take us it was $225 million. It would take us 32 years to complete work that needed to happen then. And so we really started to investigate every tool, every path, every way possible to try to raise capital to make the required investment to protect and preserve what we had, and then at some point look to expand. And so really since 2010, we've done about 20 LIHTC deals, low-income housing tax credit deals, across our portfolio, affecting 2,300 units of housing, about $863 million of construction, actual physical improvements to where our residents live and how they experience the housing. That's not other costs, that's real dollars indoors, changing the quality of our housing and the quality of the housing that our residents experience. And that's just been tremendous. And you think Cambridge has about 3,000 units, so we're not quite through, so we still have a number of projects in front of us, and we have opportunity to expand, which we look to do hopefully in the next number of years, and add another, 400 to 700 units of affordable housing in the city. So we've been doing development. We started back decades ago. We really have leaned into mixed financing over the last 20 years. Unlike a number of other housing authorities, we've chosen, and it was really driven by our board, but mostly by our residents, to do our own development. So we have a team in place at the Housing Authority. I have an incredible staff of about 25. Who are architects, project managers, planners, construction overseers, energy consultants, finance people, who really put together these deals in a way that looks at it from a public interest point of view. So it's not only what's best right now, but it's what's best at year 15 when the tax credit investor leaves, and what's best 20 years from now, 40 years from now, so that we're a long-term owner and a long-term investor in these assets, with the idea that they'll continue to be in the public domain for a very long time.
Thank you. Deborah, do you want to
Sure.
speak from a
Is this on?
state
Yeah,
level?
okay. Hi. I actually go back social housing many decades ago when I was a key advocate for limited equity cooperatives in Massachusetts. Not syndicated, real limited equity cooperatives. It fizzled out. It wasn't a form of housing, a form of finance that Massachusetts was ready for. I've also been involved at the BHA at the very start of its mixed income redevelopment. And there, we did need to partner with outside firms, but the expertise has grown inside. I think we have to be patient with public housing authorities in this regard. So in Rhode Island, we have this $10 million set aside out of a $120 million bond bill for something called public housing development. There are many people who think they know what that means. There are many people who think they own it. Right now, I'm trying to discern what's the best route for that. We put a survey out. It's on our website and broadly distributed with a portal for responses. My bias is that for social housing and public development, we have public developers. They're public housing authorities, and that we should support them. And why create another thing in the public sphere if we've got a base? And we've got a base we did not treat well either. So in fact, most of the responses coming in so far, and a lot of the housing authorities have responded, but even nonprofits and others, they say yes, public housing authorities, that's public development, that's the direction we should go on. Please do not create something new at the state level. That said, one of the questions Mike raises comes to me. Most of our housing authorities have properties that are in very poor state. And how do I ask them to be the vehicle for new housing over here, spiffy, brand new, when their residents are living in conditions that need to be addressed, not mostly through any fault of the housing authority, but through the fault of the federal government not continuing its funding, and frankly, our elected officials, our neighbors, not putting any value on public housing. So I also become very concerned about how do we build a movement that is willing to support public-owned housing, social housing, over the long term. We have to get over the stigma, which we can do, and we have been doing it, but we need to have something that lasts a long time. I do get concerned about sustainability and what level of affordability are we talking about. Really, if you're going to be serving folks, certainly at one point in Massachusetts, if you're trying to serve anyone under 45% of average median income, not extremely low income, you needed a rental subsidy just to cover the management costs, let alone debt or anything else. And so it's still, I see Crystal going, yep. Okay. So rental subsidies are pretty much a fact of life. I don't really think mixed income, and in the Montgomery model, they're very clear. Other people do very low income housing, we don't. Our cross subsidy can't support it. So I want us to really be straightforward and honest with ourselves when we talk about this model. It's not a panacea. Construction costs are going to remain high. We need rental subsidy for serving low to very low income housing. We're going to have to keep capital costs. We're going to have to recapitalize and do capital improvements. And whether you're the housing authority or a nonprofit, you're going to need cash flow to maintain your operation. So my only caution, and the caution I'm bringing to this, and sometimes Denver gets a little frustrated with me, I know, but some of the caution I'm bringing to these conversations in Rhode Island is just this. How do we do this in a way that's replicable? How do we do this in a way that we feel comfortable that it serves the spectrum of affordability across what Rhode Island needs? And how do I mesh it with ensuring that the housing authorities have the technical assistance they need to get this done? What do I do about what's already in their portfolio that needs their attention, that needs our attention. So those are some of the things that we're struggling with. It's $10 million. It's not going to go far. Last time we did have $10 million, we helped housing authorities move projects or portfolios to a Section 8, a better subsidy base, and to get rehabbed. But it did require tax credits, does require ongoing rental subsidy. So again, lots of good here, but lots of cautions, and we have to be strategic and thoughtful, but we have to move forward too. So that's the quagmire.
So, Deb, we're already getting into all of the discussions. They're all together. Briefly, just to restate, what is your role? What do you do as a Secretary of Housing?
I'm still learning. I'm secretary since December. The department is the policy, and we've only been in existence since January 23, and we've had, as everyone says down there, I'm the fourth secretary since January 23, so. I'm stabilizing things. We are really trying to drive housing policy, bring housing policy to the top, to the forefront, imbue it in everything that we do. We do have a $120 million bond bill. We are working extremely closely with localities, with for technical assistance. Push and prod will help you, but you got to be developing housing. I also sit as the chair of the Rhode Island Housing Finance Agency, so we're working in partnership to create some programs for preservation, for homeowner rehab, for municipal technical assistance. We're trying to support planning fellows in our municipalities. A lot of municipalities don't have the staff to address housing, and big developers coming their way, and it's like, so we're trying to address that with in a number of ways. And a lot of my role is that persistent, pesky voice to 39 municipalities. You all have to come to the table to help us out.
Thank you. That was helpful. So just finally, so policy and partial powers of the purse are not that. Yeah. Okay. All right. Kenzie.
Sure. Hello, Kenzie Bach. I lead the Boston Housing Authority, which, as you've heard, employed Deborah at one point, and actually almost employed Margaret, but Cambridge got back to her faster, which the whole landscape of housing authorities in Massachusetts would be different if we had snagged her 30 years ago, but so it goes. I really appreciate it. Actually, I think 3 people have already pointed out the fact that housing authorities are the original public developers. One of the things that I think about is that the BHA has been around now for almost 9 decades, and in more of those decades than not, we were developing thousands of units of housing, right? That was actually one of our core functions. So we developed a development in South Boston, now called Mary Ellen McCormick, then called Old Harbor in the 1930s, 1,000 units. We developed another 5,000 units in the 40s, another 4,000 units in the 50s, another 2,000 units in the 60s, and then another 2,000 roughly in the 70s. And then we developed 300 new units in 1983 at a senior development, and then we stopped. And we did further development work in the sense that we redeveloped existing properties. But under the Hope 6 program, the idea there was that we were de-densifying, so we were net losing units, right? And the housing authority, like many housing authorities across the country, have actually ended up below what's called our fair cloth limit, which is sort of a high water mark of how many units we used to have. We're now 3,000 units below. It's a story of decline related to the American disinvestment in this public housing system, but it is also a story of promise and potential, because this is a muscle that we have had, and that in various ways we have maintained, and it's a set of capacities, right, that we have. And I think all the time about the fact that, Rep. Connolly was talking about the wealth inequality, and Boston is a place where we see it to an extreme degree. And when you look at the sort of way that incomes in zip codes across Boston have changed over the last 10 years, it's sort of staggering. And then I think sometimes the story that is not told is that if you looked at those data and you didn't have our public housing residents in it, you would truly have a city only for those who already have won all of life's lotteries. I mean, if you looked at the income of JP without Mildred Haley, if you looked at the income of South Boston without West Broadway, Old Colony, and Mary Ellen McCormick, if you looked at the income of Charlestown without Bunker Hill, the numbers would be stratospheric. And I think it's just so important to recognize that people who preceded us did a really important thing, that they snagged, over much objection, significant pieces of land in neighborhoods all over the city of Boston, and they built housing, and they said, seniors and people and like families with children should get to live in these neighborhoods, right? And increasingly, not only are the only people providing people, extremely low income people, with an opportunity to live in these neighborhoods, but often these days, we're the only ones providing an opportunity for seniors and families with children to live in the neighborhoods, because the housing math is just so punishing. And I think that the place that I start with social housing is that, we live in a society, in a human community, and there are some essential natural facts. And one of them is that we all start our lives needing shelter and not yet earning any income. And another is that we hope to end our lives needing shelter and no longer being expected to earn income, right? And so surely we have to have a society that has a place for that, right? And that does not exile people when they're in those places. And I think that, that's really the role we're very proud to sort of stand for. But then we have to think about, okay, well, how would we make that happen? And I think public housing's been an incredibly important program. I think the Section 8 program's been an incredibly important program. In many ways, what a lot of us operate today is actually a fusion of the Section 8 and a public housing program, which is recognizing that we need these communities anchored in our cities, but that we can't operate them on the pennies on the dollar that the feds historically gave to public housing. So we've hitched our wagon to the private landlord community, right? And so when you switch a unit, as was acknowledged before, from public housing to vouchers, you actually get to a sort of maintenance sustaining place. But neither of those programs is close to providing the amount of funding that we need to really reach that social goal. And so I think that for us as a housing authority, that's part of what makes us really interested in these new models of how do we think about public finance and public development of housing, because we see that even though we're the ones focused on the very low income folks, we see that their fate is inextricably tied up with everybody else's. Our turnover rates at the housing authority have plummeted. 20 years ago, we had 10% a year. People were getting on their feet, they got a better job, they decided to go rent an apartment in the private market, somebody else got off the wait list. Now that turnover rate is less than 3%. And so what that means is your wait lists get longer, not just because more people are feeling housing pressure, but because there's no opportunity, right? So I think I want to let Suzanne ask another question, so I'm going to just briefly acknowledge an interesting point that Deborah made, and that I think we're sort of experiencing a good answer to is, so the BHA's number one priority when it comes to development is taking care of our existing residents, right? And the fact that we have a lot of housing that's really old from the 30s, 40s, 50s. And at Mary Ellen McCormick and Charlestown, 2,000 unit developments, which at some point you'll see pictures of cycling by, we worked really closely with our residents around a redevelopment plan where we're tripling the density at both sites. And we're tripling the density, adding market housing. And our residents were big proponents of that for two reasons. One is because they recognized the cross-subsidizing potential, and the other was because they recognized that there'd be a lot of amenities that would bring. Now, we spent a lot of time making clear that those amenities would then be open to all of the subsidized residents, that we would have people mixed into buildings, that units wouldn't be different, right? I think our housing authority is really proud to have worked really well with our tenant community around all of these items, but I think for us, that's sort of the answer to the question is how do we combine the redevelopment of public housing for our existing residents with welcoming more people into these communities. And then, of course, the funny place that we've ended up is that when that was conceived, the market housing engine was running. And so the idea was that you could hitch something to it and it would go. And then completely separate from what all of us in the affordable housing world do, the market housing engine conked out, right, with the end of the sort of zero interest rate world. And so I think now we're in an interesting position where we have to resolve our problem, not relying on them, but it also in some ways gives us an opportunity to jointly solve the bigger problem, which is that question of how do we have a society that houses people.
Thank you for bringing us back to the big why question and why we need to do this. So there's a consensus on the panel that housing authorities have a role to play. There's also consensus, I think, that the public sector needs to use its muscle. I think Deborah used the word muscle, maybe in a different context. But the bigger context we're in is that public employees are being fired. There's not much money coming. Nobody even mentions the idea of raising taxes. Government should just get out of the way. So how do you make the case for yourself? I'm going to combine two questions we discussed. One is, so how do you build the narrative and make the political case for yourself? And how do you build the capacity to do the work that you want to be doing or you're already doing? It seems like Cambridge already has built the capacity. I'm just going to throw that question back to you. I don't know who wants to take it first. So how do you make the political case for yourself, and how do you build the capacity?
You know, the political case goes back to part of the stuff that Chris talked about. It's about how many people are feeling the pinch now, and a much broader understanding of the housing problem. So we are about to issue a statewide housing plan in Rhode Island, and we've put towards the front a graph, a chart that says 30% of area median, 50, and then it lists sort of the jobs or the careers that go with that. And it really translates into plain English what we mean when we say we're going to serve lower income, very low income. And a lot of people are going to see themselves or their children or their neighbor, and it's going to hit them in a very different way. We all have to start speaking in that kind of plain English, I think, to get across and build that coherent argument that spreads across the spectrum that Chris was speaking to.
And I would just add that one of the things we did a few years ago in Cambridge was to start to personalize who is on our waiting list. So it's not about numbers, it's about people, and it's about their stories and lived experiences, and really kind of focus on what we're seeing, what we're hearing every day with the folks who are applying for in need of housing or who have been successfully housed, and getting those stories out. And really, when we're talking, we're really not talking about numbers anymore. We're talking about individuals and families and people who, as Deborah said, are our neighbors and our coworkers or our folks at the bakery or the local grocery store who are really struggling to, find a place that they can live and live safely.
Yeah, very much agree about putting people at the heart of it, and also giving our residents, whether public housing residents or other tenants, like avenues to make their voices heard. I mean, we still live in a democracy, and people can really, I think, bring a level of urgency to this. And every time we've seen a housing win, it's been because people raise their voices. And that's from everything from like a very specific development like Tent City, famously in the South End in Boston, to like things that are included in the housing bond bill, right? So the reality is like, that's, all of our housing wins are built on the back of advocacy by real human beings. I think that when it comes to what can we do in this moment, in a moment that's very discouraging on the federal level, I think it is a moment where the state and the city levels have a real responsibility, and I think you're seeing it in the bond bill and other places, to seed pilots to kind of say, okay, we can't operate at the federal scale, but at the sub-federal scale, where can we put enough money together to do something that then, if it works, could actually be feasibly scaled up to deal with the challenge? Because the reality is you don't actually appropriate very large sums of money to untested ideas, right? And so you do need these like test example cases. And I would say like Montgomery County, for instance, has really like, that has lit a lot of fires because people can go and visit the buildings that they've built and see the human beings who live in them and say, hey, this seems nice and seems like it worked, right? But in a different way, Montgomery is still exceptional because it's, I think, the only housing authority in the country that is also a housing finance agency. I keep saying that out loud in case someone wants to tell me there's another one, but nobody has said so yet. So I think that like that's a model where like there's a lot of us, whether it's Atlanta or here, Chattanooga, who are sort of saying, okay, well, can the housing authorities do this in partnership with finance agencies and other entities in their states where they don't have like all those capacities under one roof? And so, I think that that's a really important, if we can get to that next step on piloting, that gets you closer to this question of like, what would you do nationally at a moment that maybe is a little bit more favorable politically? And I would also say that like, it's also a little bit about saying, well, if the federal cavalry is not coming, then how do we build the resource at the local and state levels? And that's why the revolving piece is so important. And that's why I think even people who might not love the fact that you're going to be housing people at all incomes, including high incomes, I've seen be able to get on board because it's like, oh, well, if that means that then we can do another project 5 years later, like, and keep going. And also that we have this like finance that we're not dependent on Washington's appropriation whims for, like that seems like a really powerful source for dealing with our problems.
Yeah, so my provocation earlier was that social housing is an opportunity to build and design places that the market won't do. But I think so far the consensus in Montgomery County, elsewhere, is the public developer comes in to make buildings that are already planned and permitted, bring them into reality. So given, in your wildest dreams, what would you develop as a public developer? Would it have a pool on the roof? Or what would it have? Or how is it different, or how is it not different than what the market does anyway? Given the loaded historical question, right, that early public housing tried to do just that, to do a counter model to the market. What is your position? We're in a school of architecture, architecture students thinking about what they could propose. We saw some this morning. So I don't know from which direction, who wants to answer, but in your wildest dreams, what would you do? And yes, we heard residents are a key part of this. They're a key part of making the political argument for public housing. But what would you do if you could do whatever you wanted to do?
We've never been asked that, I never had that opportunity. I think, a lot of it comes down to context, where you are, what your neighborhood is, what amenities are already around there in terms of what you would want to do. I'm fortunate enough to be a developer here in Cambridge, which has a lot of it's a public-rich amenity city. So, there are pools nearby, there are, libraries and pocket parks and all kinds of different things that I think you would have to look at, how do you lean into what's already within your community, and then what do you bring that's new to that community, and how do you open up your community so it's part of the community. Oftentimes people won't walk into a public housing development, or they don't feel invited or welcome there. And I think we've been spending time in the designs we've been doing over the last many years trying to break down those barriers and make it so that residents and neighbors alike are actually interacting and sharing the space that happens to be owned by the housing authority. We work really hard to make sure as many of our properties are places for folks to vote, because that's sometimes the only way that folks will actually come into one of our public housing communities for our elders or people with disabilities. But having them actually walk through that door and interact and be with the resident community that lives there, or even look at our community space and say, oh, can we do a community meeting there? How can we bring inside out, and how can we bring outside in? I think are the other things that I would look at as we think about design. And then how can I make it contextual to the neighborhood, and how can I lean into or add to the amenities that are in the community or maybe lacking, and try to approach it that way.
Yeah, I think design, and I say this all the time, is a tremendously valuable facilitating tool in a community. Part of the problem with the reputation of public housing is what public housing has looked like in many spaces. It doesn't have to look like that anymore, and the developments that all of you are working on and I've worked on don't look like that anymore. But that's a stigma that we have to overcome. So yes, design is absolutely essential. It needs to be contextual. It needs to take a little baby step maybe forward with bravery, but not too boldly. And communal space is really important. We get, a criticism across the board when you're doing housing. You're wasting money. You've got kitchens or you've got a community space. No, we're building community too. So we do need those spaces. So I don't apologize for that at all. So good design, extremely well, and this is not unique to social housing. This is the key thing. Extremely well managed, whether it's self-managed or professionally managed. That's lots of public housing fell down because it was not managed well. And then I do think I don't worship mixed income housing. I think mixed income housing is great, but you don't just put folks in an apartment building together and presume they're all going to mix and they're all going to, help each other's kids find jobs and stuff like that. You need something else to get that going. I also don't want to, and I don't want to apologize or for housing that is serving predominantly lower income households and doesn't have that market rate component. Again, if it's well managed, well designed, it's going to be fine. So I'm a little, I'm agnostic on mixed income, except that it helps sometimes with support, except it sometimes helps with the politics of what you're doing. But let's call it for what it is sometimes too.
Yeah, I think I totally agree that design is really important, and I think that having I think in many ways we benefit from the fact that we're almost always building things for actual residents who already exist, and so we have the opportunity to consult them, and so which frankly, like lots of developers who are building something de novo don't have that opportunity. So I'll give an example. Like we partnered with Two Life Communities to do we had a public housing development that was for elders and people with disabilities that was right next to a large campus that they had, and our problem was that our housing was deeply inaccessible, which is not great for the population that we were housing. So we were looking to do a redevelopment that would really provide state-of-the-art accessible housing, and ended up, with them building this beautiful building that connects to their whole campus, and they now manage. But a thing that came out of the design process with the residents was that a bunch of the senior residents were like, my grandchildren come to visit me and I want a little playground in front of the development. And that just would not have been something that someone back at the real estate office dreamed up, right? Because it's playgrounds are for family developments and not for senior developments. And there ended up being this beautiful playground that also actually ended up being the very creative solution to a huge grade change at the site, because it has a kind of climbing, winding pathway component. And so, that's just one of the examples of kind of human-centered design things that we've seen. But, I think the community space is the number one thing that if you asked us, that's always getting engineered out. Or you have to go, in our line of work, you usually are looking for another set of different tax credits to help pay for you to have a community gathering space. And so I think if we could stop having those spaces feel so optional in terms of how we finance everything and really put them at the heart of things, I think that that's a real desire of ours.
Those are great, three very different responses to the design question. Thank you. We have 1.5 minutes till you guys get to ask questions. So just one answer. If there's something in the regulation of housing authorities you could change. So public entities are generally much more stringently supervised and are a stronger set of rules that you have to abide by. Bidding rules, access to funding, amount of paperwork that you need to do to prove compliance. If there's one thing you could change to make your life easier, what would it be?
Well, all of it, I guess. Because in some ways, all of them contribute to the challenges, and I think that what makes it difficult to be successful as a public housing authority, either in the property management operations of it or the development of it. I focus on the development side of the house, and our costs are routinely 50% higher than what a private developer would experience. And that's when we already have the land. So if you add land cost to it, it becomes even more astronomical. And it gets really difficult when there's competing, such a dramatic need for housing, and we're so much more expensive. And a private developer or a for-profit developer can develop it much less. Then there's a impetus then to, all right, privatize it. But then we do miss the kind of opportunities that Representative Connolly mentioned in terms of having that capital kind of boomerang back and benefit the housing and the housing community and the residents in really substantive ways. And I think that's the thing that intrigues us so much about social housing, because we feel like that resource back, to the representative's point about how do you combine that or even Deborah's point about how do you do it when you have existing housing that's in such poor condition. Well, you combine it together, and that you bring up the entire agency, the entire portfolio, but you've got to start somewhere. So I can see a state public housing site being a location for social housing. And not only would you have the opportunity to improve those units, but then you would add a whole richness of new units to some communities that may have not seen any kind of multifamily housing in a long time. So I see it as a way to strengthen public housing authorities and public ownership, but I worry about the playing field and how do you level it so we can be that player, because I think we at the core can be very effective stewards of the housing. We provide a level of services that I think our residents really benefit from, and I think it really would be a really welcome tool for us moving forward.
I want to give
Margaret.
just one sentence.
Public bidding laws in Massachusetts.
I know.
Right.
That's my favorite. I said 50%.
Okay, that's good enough. And Kenzie, because I'm sure there are. One thing, top of the list.
I actually think, especially as we tip into social housing, more flexibility for how to have families not experience the benefits cliff. We're seeing families, so we've at BHA done a huge amount of work to make sure we won't have the experience of redeveloping and then families can't move back for various reasons. But then recently, having overcome a lot of those issues, I think it's very heartbreaking for me when families can't move back because their income has improved in the time that we've been doing the redevelopment. And I think thinking about, could another silver line, not even silver line, good thing about social housing be the opportunity to have people at more gradients, and there would be kind of regulatory changes you would need for that.
Audience, please. We have 2 mic runners. You wanted to clap? Yeah, no, we can clap, but now. Thank you all. That was great. I'm sure we have questions. If you have a question, could you stand and introduce yourself and ask a question rather than making a statement?
Ready? Gail Sullivan, I'm an architect. We do affordable housing. I wanted to jump off on what Kenzie was talking about building communities, not just building housing. One of our frustrations is because of the way that the funding works, it's very hard to add into affordable housing, especially public affordable housing, any of the amenities. I don't just mean a community room. The schools, the childcare, the services that tenants need. And maybe this combines with the idea of how Margaret's idea of inviting people in, of making these developments more porous. What if we put a public school in the middle of one of the developments?
I'm in charge of looking at the clock, and I'm sorry we already overran. But do you have a question?
That was it.
What was the question?
Well, how can we do that? How can we add these things into it? Does that require regulatory change?
Okay, great. Thank you. Should we collect questions, or do you want to take that right now? Let's take 2 or 3 questions, and then maybe they speak to each other.
Hey, I'm Grayson Lochner. I'm a state representative in Maine. My question, well, first of all, I did want to say I visited Vienna, where they do have rooftop pools, and the rents range from like $450 to $550 a month. So it's doable there. To that one point, I did want to say or ask the question. In Maine, our housing authorities have largely spun off their own nonprofits and are doing development very similar to any other mission-driven nonprofit. So when we're asking housing authorities to sort of take on this role, which I agree they should have, similar to Montgomery County, are we talking about them doing it in the nonprofit world, or are we talking about them maintaining it within the public sphere so that therefore the gains go towards the public and it's really about creating housing for everybody?
That's a great question. Could we take maybe, why don't you guys pick, red cap.
A great panel, thank you. I'm wondering if the panelists could comment on the importance of tenant organizing against displacement as something that sets up the sales to social housing. A lot of us here in this row, the successes we've experienced in getting buildings out of the market have come as a result of vigorous tenant organizing against displacement.
That's a great question. It's also will be addressed directly in panel 2. So maybe, who else do we have? Here, right here.
Hi, I'm Sarah Dunbar, also an architect. So I have a question that relates specifically to Boston and to the small MOH sites that have been being brought into development. And so the city's been offloading those and doing mostly home ownership affordable housing. I'm wondering if you think there's a path where small sites like that could become social housing and stay under the city's ownership, and if you could speak to that and just what the scale or threshold is at which you think social housing is successful.
Yeah, why don't you each take one of these questions that you want to respond? So it seems like Boston, that was for you.
That was definitely for me. So I would say that is this still on? Okay. I would say that in Boston, we're definitely kind of taking a all of the above strategy. And so actually, for instance, those are sites that are owned by the city of Boston, and the Mayor's Office of Housing is trying to make sure that there are home ownership opportunities that are in the neighborhoods. And that's in response to a lot of neighborhood feedback about wanting more opportunities for home ownership. But actually, the BHA has a scattered site portfolio in the same neighborhoods as well. And there, we've actually assessed a bunch of our sites to look at, okay, there are a few where what makes sense is for us to do home ownership because it's a very small lot, or we just own one condo in a larger building and it doesn't really work for us to have a rental unit there for various systems related reasons, but it would be great to have a first-time home buyer buy it. But there's a bunch of those sites where we think we could actually do fair cloth units and additional rental housing and keep it in our portfolio. And even with the home ownership, we're only looking at sites to switch a rental unit to home ownership where we're able to net build more rental in the end, because we don't want to lose any of the deeply affordable rental housing. But I think it's just, you have a bunch of different portfolios and you have a lot of different housing needs, both on the ownership rental spectrum and the income spectrum. And so the city's trying to think about how we have resources for all of them. And I will just say, even though the other panel is going to talk about it to Steve's question, that I totally agree. I think tenant organizing creates the conditions for lots of important things to happen in the housing world. And sometimes it's even just an implicit thing. In my prior life as a city councilor, remember having a conversation with a developer who owned a building that was going to expire right out of affordability. But just the fact that they knew that the tenant community was so organized and that there was just no way that the city was going to let them get the permissions to do another non-affordable thing, it changes the whole conversation without even having that part of the conversation explicitly. And I think that you can't underestimate the power, again, of people raising their voices.
And if I can just jump on that, because I think in Cambridge, we really go at and have a robust tenant process. And we do that, and when we come to a site, maybe they haven't had as much activity with their tenant council or tenant representative, but when construction shows up, boy, do people get activated. But we do our best work when we have an engaged, active, vocal tenant community, to the point of, we really work hard to try to get those voices to the table, using as many different ways and means and methods as we can, whether it's knocking on doors, phone calls, whether it's Saturday hours, evening hours, coffee hours, however we can get residents engaged and involved. We want them at the table, and they're critical voices, and they really make a difference in the quality of our housing. And then I just wanted to talk a little bit about the main question about the private or nonprofit ownership, and it's hard. Not every nonprofit's the same, so you have to kind of look under the hood a little bit. And I'm sure folks have been looking at the Cambridge graph, looking at how many different organizations fall under the CHA these days, and there are a lot, and there are a lot of nonprofits, but every one of them is an instrumentality or 100% controlled by the housing authority. So even though some of our development activity falls under the nonprofit, it all falls under the umbrella of the housing authority. And I just don't know what the story would it be in Maine, whether or not the boards are the same and whether the missions and alignments are the same. But the nonprofits have been a really important and useful tool to the housing authority's efforts to both develop new housing, but also to maintain and support what we have.
Just to add on to that, the HUD does not allow housing authorities to take on debt. And they probably can't be situated to be a direct partner in a tax credit deal. So in Massachusetts, at least, well, anywhere under a HUD, you do have to spin off something that's related to you in order to be able to take on debt or otherwise engage in structuring the real estate finance. But again, wholly owned and controlled, so the benefits flow back up.
And if I can just say one thing on the first question about schools and integrating other public uses, I actually think this is one of the ways in which housing authorities building back our public developer of housing role can be very helpful, because we've had a lot of conversations with, like the public schools in Boston, and we're actually really excited to be collaborating on building over a public library in Boston, where we think that it's going to be really great to have families and seniors living above the library. That is such a beloved resource. But you really do run into like challenges with mixed methods. Like the public facilities sort of world knows how to build public schools and public libraries, and then our whole world knows how to build housing, and combining those two things is like a lot of brain damage. But I think that there's such an obvious synergy, and also not for nothing, in a lot of our dense cities, a lot of the best sites are sites where we have a public facility that might only be 1 or 2 stories. So there's clearly a need there. I don't think that the public facilities departments are gonna learn how to do housing. So I think it is probably like having a really like effective public developer, because often with those public facilities, it's quite important that the building remain publicly owned. Like, I think that there's an opportunity for fusion that could really unlock a lot there.
Okay, back to the audience.
Hi, I have a question. Hi, I'm Lena. I'm one of the doctoral candidates here at Harvard, and I'm also one of the fellows actually currently at BHA. And I think there's a lot of value in bringing this panel together, because although it is within the New England area, that still there's some variations of how work is being handled from one area to another. And that brings, for example, the moving to work status that Cambridge has, whereas Boston, for example, doesn't have, to surface. And I'm curious about, because that is in itself, I think, a very effective tool to mingle and convert more public housing, for example, into like voucher, under the voucher program. So I'm just curious about how could we leverage better like learning opportunities from within the area of New England Bridge. Thank you.
Let's collect some more. Standing, oh no, right there, yeah.
Cambridge Housing Authority is very impressive in terms of the number of affiliates that you have, and there are a handful of housing authorities in Massachusetts that have done that. But it seems that there are many communities where there is a housing authority, but there is not a CDC or nonprofit developer, where there are opportunities to develop affordable housing, mixed income housing. And I'm wondering, what seems to be the difficulty in getting more housing authorities into this role of sort of public developer?
take two more, right here.
Hi, I'm Jacinda Barbahan, representing the Congress of New Urbanism. I'm interested in understanding the question of scale that was talked about earlier and how we can potentially unlock a different kind of social housing that more, it fits form-based into the communities that already exist vis-a-vis the legislations that both Massachusetts and Rhode Island currently have in their nascent state in their legislatures around single stairways and code reform along those lines.
We are going to have those questions be discussed over coffee. Is that correct? Okay, we can answer them.
In terms of housing authorities that aren't ready, a lot are too small. They don't understand this world, and that's why I mean we have to be gentle with some of them, right? I mean, let's take a moment. Let's help partner. Let them partner. And if they don't have the expertise, God love them for acknowledging that. The worst are the ones who want to do it and don't know what they don't know. So let's take some steps to move folks along, and they can partner with the Cambridge Housing Authority.
Yeah, this is my plug, because the Cambridge Housing Authority does provide consulting services to other housing authorities. We are currently working with 12 different housing authorities, maybe more, in Massachusetts and one in Maine. And really, the housing authorities started reaching out to us about 5 or 6 years ago saying, how can we do what you're doing in Cambridge? And, well, actually it goes much longer than that. For many years we said no, because we had too much work in front of us, and our portfolio needs were so great. But about 5 or 6 years ago, we started to say yes, and we've been making huge differences in communities like Medford and Brockton and Belmont and Lexington and Watertown. And,
we have to wrap up, so
Margaret
is available for conversation. Kenzie, last word.
Oh, I would just say on single stair and such, I think it's very important for housing authorities that any innovations in building code happen at the general level and that they not be piloted at housing authorities. I think when you think about the Grenfell fire disaster in the UK and just like some of the traditions, like when you're housing the lowest income folks, you don't want to be at the cutting edge of a pilot on building code stuff, even if it turns out to be like the best innovation. I just don't think that we would want to be like the people who do it first, just because of if something did go awry, I think it would read in a way that we wouldn't want.
Fantastic. Now we can applaud. Thank you. Thanks so much.